guns and money. This shit has hit the fan. And lawyers, guns, and money.
Years ago, there was a song by Warren Zevon entitled Lawyers, Guns, and Money. However, that title might just as well be a description of our American electoral process today. It seems that lawyers, money, and enforcement are an ever-growing part of elections in America. A new set of rules seem to prevail. Issues such as campaign finance, voting rights, voter ID, and ballot access itself are all now contentious parts of voting in America. How did we get here? And how did democracy become so complicated? We're going to talk about that today with my guest, David Schultz. He is Hamline University professor in the School of Business. He also holds appointments in the university's Department of Criminal Justice and Forensic Science, where he teaches classes on crime, criminal procedure, and policing. He also teaches at the Minnesota Law School, where he teaches election law, professional responsibility, and state constitutional law. He's a senior fellow at the Institute of Law and Politics at the University of Minnesota, and it is my pleasure to welcome David Schultz to Radio Who, What, Why to talk about his book, Election Law and Democratic Theory. David Schultz, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. Have elections and the democratic process in this country always been as complicated as they seem today?
Yes and no. In a sense of complicated, we've always had a very difficult set of rules, really from 1787, the writing of the Constitution, to the present, where we've had sets of rules that govern how we elect the president, what the Electoral College. We have, at one point, remember, we couldn't elect senators. They were chosen by state legislatures. The rules for who gets to vote are picked at the state level, subject to some constitutional rights that Congress has to be able to set some rules for federal elections. And so we've always sort of had a certain veneer of complexity out there and a tremendous amount of disputes over time regarding who gets to vote and who gets to run for office. But to a large extent, I would argue that the real contemporary battle in terms of voting rights and in terms of our election process really starts with Florida 2000. Mm-hmm. And by Florida 2000, that sort of encapsulates everything that happened in the race for president between George Bush and Al Gore in 2000, and the disputed election, of course, in Florida in 2000.
And part of what encapsulates it in 2000 is the degree to which the legal system, it seems, became so much a part of the electoral process. Now it is commonplace, we hear, when major elections happen, or certainly every 2 years, that both political parties have teams of lawyers standing by to triage them to whatever states or whatever campaigns may be close. More and more of it is focusing on the courts as well as the electoral process.
You're absolutely correct. And again, if we think about, again, Florida 2000, the real legal battles took place the day after the election, where the election was very close, and some of us might remember all the battles there regarding counting of ballots and Florida election officials holding up ballots in the air. We heard about dimple chads and pregnant chads and three-quarter chads, but the whole legal battle took place over what votes to count and how to count them after the election, and the Supreme Court decision, Bush v. Gore, took place after. And you're exactly correct in the sense that now what we increasingly see are people going to court before the election, either challenging election rules that are in place, or in some other circumstances, going to legislatures to change the rules. And so this past election cycle, for example, we saw across the United States in places such as Wisconsin, for example, challenges before election day to voter ID. Or in Texas, we saw the same thing. In places like Ohio and North Carolina, we saw efforts to challenge early voting. And in places like Florida, efforts to challenge or raise claims saying that the waiting time to vote was going to be too long for some people, potentially be too long. And so now, to a large extent, it's sort of, as you said in the beginning of the great Warren Zevon song, Lawyer, Guns, and Money. The lawyers, guns, and money come in before the election and are used at that point to try to influence perhaps the outcome. Because to a large extent, who gets to vote, the rules determining who gets to vote or who gets on the ballot has a large impact regarding, of course, who may eventually win.
Of course, what it's about at core is this idea of voter suppression.
Yes, absolutely. There's no question about it. And we have to sort of start with a real simple proposition right off the bat, is that there's a huge partisan disagreement over both voter suppression and over the whole claim of voter fraud in the United States. And I really want to link the two together. And I say that if we think about sort of a couple of traditions in American history, there's this, on one hand, this wonderful tradition in American history that from 1787 to the present, we have in general loosened the restrictions on who's allowed to vote. It made it easier for people of color, for women. We've enlarged the size of our franchise. But at the same time, we've also had this sort of ugly tradition where we've actually tried to suppress voting. And the best example is, or the first example, and I call the first great disenfranchisement, is after the Civil War. After the Civil War, the Republican Party, and people forget this, the Republican Party pushed hard to try to enfranchise the freed male slaves in the South to vote, and temporarily they were able to do so. But then the Democrats undertook a process of basically ending Reconstruction and suppressing that right to vote that really lasted until the 1960s. And from the 60s up until, I want to say, Florida 2000, we were on another expansion. We were making it easier to vote, facilitating the process for people to get to the ballot. And now there's this battle again. There's a battle over voter suppression. And again, there's a partisan overlay to this, unfortunately, now, where generally individuals who are supporting voter ID, who are arguing that there's significant voter fraud in the system, who are arguing against early voting, generally, if not almost exclusively, are Republicans, and Democrats are fighting it. And so that's part of the battle that we see, what I call the second great disenfranchisement in America, is really this effort to try to limit who gets to vote on Election Day or before Election Day, with the idea being that's going to have a huge impact in terms of who turns out. And the best studies tell us at this point that a lot of these laws are targeted at or impact young people and people of color, for example, and poor people who generally, if they do vote, will support the Democrats.
It really is. I mean, to take that a step further, more than partisan at this point, it really is about racial profiling at the ballot box in some respects, and really brings us full circle back to the original reason for the Voting Rights Act in the mid-1960s.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, a good example is about 3 weeks or 4 weeks before the election this past, I think it was early October, a federal district court judge in Texas struck down the state's voter ID law. The Supreme Court eventually allowed that law to go into effect for the election, but that judge noted, for example, that with that law going into effect, it would disenfranchise approximately 600,000 people currently registered to vote, and it would have between a 2 and 3 times greater impact upon people of color than it would have upon white Caucasians. And so that judge noted, as did a couple of other judges in other states, that this law really does target people of color. And again, if we put a partisan overlay to this, let's think about what we know in the last presidential or last 2 presidential elections. Barack Obama secured approximately 95 or so % of the African American vote, in excess of 60%, actually excess of 70% of Hispanic, excess of 70% of Asian votes. And so people of color are overwhelmingly voting for Democrats and voted for Barack Obama in the last 2 presidential election cycles. And laws that effectively disenfranchise even some of that population can clearly tip the balance of elections. And it's possible very possible, some people are arguing, that this past November, when Democrats lost some very close races, for example, in North Carolina and a couple of other places, it may very well have been as a result of voter suppression techniques.
I want to come back to this point that you linked it to earlier in terms of voter fraud, because that's the excuse we hear for so much of this restrictive procedure. And yet the amount of voter fraud that actually has or does take place is almost non-existent.
Correct. And I always like to use as a benchmark is an official statistic from the National Weather Service. And the National Weather Service will say that your chances of being struck by lightning in any given year are between about 1 out of 700,000 and 1 out of 1 million. So it's pretty remote. Okay, that's our benchmark, being struck by lightning in a year. The absolute best studies, and there's been scores of studies done on this, place the chances of showing that an election was the outcome was overturned by or distorted by voter fraud is somewhere in the range of about 5 or 10 out of 150 million. When I use that number, it is looking at a number in terms of documented, proven cases of in-person voter fraud that occur at the polls. Put that in another perspective, that the chances of finding voter fraud, in-person voter fraud at the polls, is about the same chances that we have in terms of winning Powerball. It's incredibly remote. And there are many states that have passed voter ID laws when they'll acknowledge and say, in our entire history, for example, Indiana, one of the first states to do this, Indiana acknowledged and said, we have never had a proven case of in-person voter fraud in the entire history of the state. And so we are passing laws on the pretense of voter fraud when, in fact, there is no evidence to sustain that voter fraud is really systemic, at least the type that they're asserting.
It's interesting to think about why there is so little voter fraud. I mean, it gets talked about a lot. It's used, as you say, as a pretense, and yet the reality is entirely different. It's interesting to think about why that is.
Well, a couple of things is that it always becomes a great excuse, I think, for losers to claim and say they didn't lose the election fair and square. They lost it because the other side cheated. I think that's one. I think second, if we go back earlier times in American history, there was voter fraud, but most of the fraud that occurs is, again, not, and we need to be clear on this, is not in-person voter fraud at the polls where like a David Schultz shows up, claims that he's somebody else, and votes in behalf of that person, or I show up to vote intentionally thinking that I'm going to vote when I'm not eligible. Instead, where most of the great stories of voter fraud have occurred in the United States have been usually what I call sort of election official fraud, where election officials or currently people in power rig elections for their own particular favor. I mean, one of my favorite stories, it's still, I think it's out of one of Robert Caro's biographies of Lyndon Johnson, and points out that when he first ran for I think it was state senate back in the 1940s in Texas, he was behind, and then miraculously at the last minute, I think it's something around 100 people from one small town in Texas all vote for him. It turns out that they're all dead, and just it was convenient they happened to all vote in alphabetical order for him. It's a great story, but it's about not voters committing fraud. It's about the political system committing fraud. And the history in the United States, more often than not, is when the fraud does occur, it occurs there, where somebody who's an election official or a current office holder manipulates things. And so we have these kind of anecdotal stories. We have sort of, I guess I want to say it, our folklore stories of the Daley regime in Chicago or corrupt politics in New Jersey, that lend some credence to the idea that, yeah, there's probably some fraud in the system, but then we jump immediately to this idea of saying that it's the voters committing the fraud, and then, therefore, if elections turn out to be in ways that one doesn't think they're supposed to be, in terms of the result, the losing side will say it's got to be, of course, because of fraud. It's got to be because of all these ineligible people. It's felons. It's criminals. It is immigrants, whoever it may be. It's somebody else who voted, not the people who should be entitled to vote.
The irony is that where there has been fraud in places like Chicago or Texas or New Jersey, to name the big three, the truth of the matter is that the fraud balances itself out over time.
It probably does. I was going to say is that if you sort of look at what little leaders are out there, it probably does turn out to be a wash. Like I said, for every story of a Lyndon Johnson, who wound up, getting the election to favor him, there's probably the story of at least, one Republican, if not more, also who benefited from the system. And so, I hate to sort of say that kind of corruption might be equal opportunity across parties, but there may be a little bit of truth to that in the sense that it is equal opportunity. But no, I mean, the best studies out there, again, and some of the research that I've done in my book talks about this, and I do a pretty exhaustive study of what all the studies are in terms of voter fraud, point out and say that, again, in-person voter fraud is actually quite negligible. Not saying it doesn't occur, but it's quite negligible. But where the fraud does occur, if at all, is either in terms of absentee ballots, or it occurs, again, in terms of election officials. And in neither of those cases do the current voter ID laws that have been proposed and have been adopted in about 36 states, do any of those laws address either voter fraud and absentees or election official fraud. One of the best studies out there was called the Carter-Baker study. Former President Jimmy Carter, former Secretary of State James Baker, so bipartisan panel, and basically reached that conclusion and said there's very little fraud in the system. Again, the biggest area to be concerned about is again in terms of absentee. Another way for me to phrase this is that the best statistics indicate about 37% of the American population voted. Roughly 2/3 of Americans stayed home on Election Day. To me, it's hard to reconcile widespread voter fraud at the same time that we have significant apathy and significant non-voting in the American political system. Somehow the idea of people clamoring to go to elections on Election Day and risk committing a felony is at odds with our statistics on how few people actually vote in the United States.
Right, but from an institutional perspective, and this gets back to the point that you were making before, that given the level of money that is part of the political system and the government system today, it does provide the apathy and lack of voter participation provides added incentive for institutions or local officials or election boards or whatever to rig the system.
Yes, correct. Yeah, I mean, first off, and we talk about money on two levels. Money in the sense that, we just went through an election which became the first non-presidential election system or a cycle in American history where more money was spent on it than during a presidential election year. We spent more money this past November election cycle, over $4 billion, more than was spent during a presidential cycle. So first, there's an enormous amount of money being spent, but where the real money is all about here, and this is where the incentive for fraud among election officials might be huge, is because it costs so much to run for office. They are indebted to huge contributors, indebted to people who are spending a lot of money. There may very well be enormous pressures in terms of letting out contracts, federal bids for contracts, state contracts, and so forth. And it's there where election officials may have incentives to say that because, we have to raise all this kind of money and we have to pay back contributors in some way, where the fraud probably comes into the system.
Two other big changes that we've seen since 2000 is a much greater degree of early voting, which you alluded to before, and so much mail-in voting. In certain states, it is the only way to vote. Talk a little bit about the impact of that.
Well, that's actually interesting because, again, we have now somewhere in the number of around 37, 38 states that have some form of early voting or mail-in ballots, whether partially or exclusively. And one of the assumptions was that early voting or giving people more opportunities to be able to vote would again lead to an uptick in voter turnout, that it would be more convenient for people and therefore they would want to vote. Because one of the theories about voting is that it's a cost-benefit decision, that if it's the costs outweigh the benefits, I don't vote. Therefore, if we make it easier to vote, more people will vote. And there's some evidence to support that. But where we are in terms of early voting and where we are in terms of mail-in voting is again, I talk about this in my book, is that the evidence is inconclusive. And it's a terrible thing to say, but it's inconclusive in terms of whether or not more people are actually voting as a result of early voting, or people are just shifting their voting from election day to an earlier period sometime before the election. And again, if we look at this past election, where we had more states having more liberalized laws regarding early voting than we've ever had, we had some of the lowest voter turnout in the United States, in probably a generation, if not longer. So it's not clear what impact the early voting has. Having said that, I certainly wouldn't argue against it, because there are clearly other forces that could be explaining why people aren't voting, whether it be not feeling that they have choices. It could have something to do with poverty issues, other forms of discrimination. But the early voting has not necessarily proved to be the success that people want. It's certainly not a failure, but it's certainly changed campaigns. And how it's changed campaigns is in the sense that I would used to describe a campaign as like running a race. That November 2nd, November 3rd, whatever the date of the election is, that's the finish line. You want to get across that finish line. That's when you want to peak. Now we have elections where people across the country can start voting 45 days in federal elections before the election, for early ballots that go out in many states. And that means that candidates have to now start messaging and making sure that they can get their messages out to really a rolling wave of population of voters who will start voting 45 days before the election. And so it makes a messaging complexity here, but also it changes campaigns in the sense that what a lot of candidates now and what the parties are doing is saying, okay, let's get all our supporters to vote early, get them locked up, put them in the bank, basically get the votes in the bank, and then worry about, getting the undecided voters. And so it's clearly changed political strategies, and the different parties have changed their tactics in terms of this. About 10 years ago, the Republicans were more successful in getting early voters out. In recent elections, Democrats have been more successful in getting early voters out.
This sort of circles back to the idea of early voting not really resulting in significant more participation, is that because it has changed the cycle of campaigns, because it doesn't move forward towards that proverbial finish line and creating a kind of critical mass and excitement around that, is that it feeds into general apathy that's out there about the process in general.
Yeah, there is some evidence of that. I mean, again, there is some evidence that because we don't sort of have a defining sort of focal point day, that elections for some people have lost a little bit of that luster in terms of being a big event. And there may be ways of counteracting that. I mean, among things that people have talked about are the idea of saying that, we have national holidays, for example, for lots of things, but Election Day is not a national holiday. Maybe that should be. Or we make things such as Thanksgiving, or depending on where you are, Veterans Day, or depending on where you are, Columbus Day, we make that a paid holiday. Why not make Election Day a paid holiday if we're going to still have elections on a Tuesday, for example, and do something where as a culture, as a society, we say we view this as important enough of a day that we're going to give people time off with money if they're working to go vote on that day, and really make that a focal point of our culture. We don't do that right now. Many other societies around the world, countries around the world do that, and among other things, they do have dramatically higher turnout rates than we have in the United States.
One of the things that we seem to be moving towards, we had this issue circling around 2000, but there's a sense that maybe it's going to be an even bigger issue in national elections, is this disconnect between popular vote and electoral college. Do you see some kind of clash coming over that in the not-too-distant future?
No, I thought we were going to... Well, first off, yes. I think if you survey the American public, I think the vast majority of the American public in polls do not like the Electoral College. That for whatever reasons there may have been back in 1787 to have the Electoral College, and some of it reflects different attitudes towards people, different attitudes towards democracy. They have changed. And I think most Americans probably would say they like the idea of whoever gets the most popular vote should win the presidential election. And right now I think it's still mostly, I would say, people who are sort of Democrats who are in that position, partially because I think of, again, in 2000, where Al Gore wins the popular vote by, I think, over 500,000 votes, but loses to George Bush. I keep thinking that if there's a point where it reverses, at some point where a Republican wins the popular vote but loses in the Electoral College, that might create enough support on both sides to do something. But yes, I think there's a clear disconnect out there, and the Electoral College creates other types of perversities also. One of the claims, and I think there's evidence to support this, is that I oftentimes say is that if you're a Democrat in Texas or a Republican in New York, your incentives for voting in the presidential election are almost nil, simply because of the winner-take-all systems that are there. The other perversity is that the presidential election, I can make an easy prediction right now for 2016, is that about 41 states are already decided, maybe 42. The race is already over in 41, 42 states, and then it'll come down to about 8 states again. It'll be the Ohio, the North Carolinas, the Floridas. That's where the whole battleground is. And so most of us will never see a presidential candidate or have a serious presidential contest in our state. And that leads to basically, I think, many people saying, well, why should I go to vote? There's no excitement here. No candidates are coming here. And I think the Electoral College, besides being anti-democratic, is really now starting to depress or suppress voter turnout, especially in states which are not viewed as real swing states.
Yeah, it's interesting. It used to be that in presidential elections it was the top of the ballot that drove voter turnout. Now people that do vote are generally voting because of down ballot issues or candidates as opposed to presidents in those 40-some-odd states you're talking about.
You're absolutely correct. We're seeing it could be a Senate race, it could be ballot propositions, it could be, who knows, state legislative races at this point. And so the presidency isn't the one driving it. In fact, it may be hurting turnout because, again, we usually think of the presidential race as the one that's generating the most news, the most excitement. People are hearing in the news that, president's up for election, it's election day, come out to vote, et cetera, et cetera. But again, in approximately 40, 42 states, depending on how you count it, you're not getting those messages coming from the candidates and the parties to say there's an important election coming. The messages are having to come from, as you said, the down-ballot candidates or issues. And so for the vast majority of the population and the vast majority of states in the country, the presidential election is somewhat irrelevant. I could even push it further. I always kid people and say that even within those 8 or 9 states, there's only about 10 counties that matter. And I could push it even further, and I tell my students and say that it all comes down to Hamilton County, Ohio. Hamilton County, Ohio is where Cincinnati is, and whoever wins Hamilton County, Ohio, wins Ohio. Whoever wins Ohio wins the presidency. Now, I'm not down to quite yet saying, whoever Harry and Louise vote for determines the presidency, but we're down to a point where it's, in some sense, it's very small geographic competitive areas in the United States that really are driving the presidential election at this point.
The other side of it is that with all the criticism about money in politics, and you touched on it before with respect to this last midterm costing $4 billion, that if presidential candidates had to be competitive in 50 states, the cost would be astronomical?
Well, clearly, many people will argue and say that we don't spend enough money on politics. That if we look at how much money we spend on, for example, pet supplies versus campaigns and elections, we don't spend enough. And perhaps there's an argument on that. But there are a variety of ways of rethinking the cost issues. For example, for the value that there still is of network television, for example. The public owns the airways, and there's no reason why the Federal Communications Commission can't require free or reduced airtime there. Additionally, as we're starting to see that campaigns are dramatically moving off of television, for example. They're moving on to the internet. They're moving on to the social media, to our cell phones, for example. And so if we think of alternative ways of campaigning that are more effective for a new generation of voters coming up, it changes the cost factor. And additionally, if we are willing to rethink the way we finance elections, in terms of public financing for elections or systems that empower small donors in a political system, then the cost factor changes. The issue becomes not how much a political system costs, but who's financing it and how. And so there are ways. There's no question that a serious 50-state campaign may very well cost more money. But on the other hand, there are lots of forces out there that suggest that the way campaigns are changing now in terms of how they reach people, that the biggest driver of cost, which is media costs, again, network television being the best example, they are becoming potentially more irrelevant over time.
Professor David Schultz, his book is Election Law and Democratic Theory. David, I thank you so much for spending time with us. Thanks for listening on WhoWhatWhy.org radio. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share it and help other people find it by rating and reviewing us on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do at Who, What, Why by visiting us at WhoWhatWhy.org /donate.